Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge and I'm the convener for this webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. The association's mission is to advance the research and practical application of the social capital concept. And if you're interested in joining the community, being a member of the association, you can find out information on our website, and perhaps you'd like to check out details about our upcoming conference in Dubai next year. In this session, I'll be giving a webinar talking about the potential to unify the paradigm or the field of social capital research to seek similarities between different approaches to social capital, rather than always seeing different definitions and different conceptual approaches as being different and incompatible and incapable of making comparisons between each other in ways that perhaps could add to and build on existing knowledge in ways that could be really important for practical applications. So I began this work really over 20 years ago. What I was doing at the time was I wanted to use the concept of social capital in research, but I was not inclined to use it empirically. At the time, the concept was fairly new. It had only been around probably for about 10 years. And I had some pretty serious concerns about the use of the concept in research. So I had concerns about clarity. It wasn't really clear what it was. I had concerns about logic, how it functioned, probably because it wasn't really clear what it was. There seemed to be a lot of assumptions embedded within the concept, and it really wasn't all that clear what the outcomes were. So I had questions, these kinds of really key fundamental questions about why is it social? Why is it capital? What does it do? How does it function? Where does it reside? And many of these questions were difficult to get answers to in the literature at the time. And even now, some of these questions can be difficult to get answers to. And so my conclusion over 20 years ago was that I wasn't sure exactly what we were going to be measuring in research, why we were measuring those things, and if it was going to produce useful knowledge that then could inform interventions that will be effective in the real world. And so I decided not to do empirical research back then. Instead, I started working on the concept itself. I wanted to try to answer these kinds of questions and bring together the different approaches in the literature and help other researchers hopefully to understand the concept better and therefore apply the concept more effectively. Because I do still, obviously, I've spent the last 20 years working on this, I still do believe the concept is extremely important and valuable. It's just that we need to improve the way in which we use it, and particularly we need to make those improvements across and between the existing approaches that exist in the literature and, of course, in practice as well. So the goal of unification isn't to produce another competing approach. That's certainly not what I'm trying to achieve here whatsoever. We want to create some sort of perhaps an ontology, if you like, of social capital that has the potential to inform the paradigm. I didn't want to use the word ontology in the title of the presentation. I think a lot of academics even are scared of what ontology means. They probably feel like they should know what it means, but maybe they're not quite sure. But really, an ontology is just establishing what we know, what we agree on as the foundation. And so it's not limited to just one theory. It has more of a meta-theoretical approach, and it can perhaps bring coherence to fragmented conceptual landscapes, especially in interdisciplinary work, if we can come to agree on some fundamental basis of how we understand things. And so it clarifies the concepts of social capital. I don't want this, as I said, I don't want this to be seen as just another competing conceptual approach to social capital. This is a way to try to understand all of the existing approaches and how they work together to produce a coherent body of knowledge. So it seeks to identify those similarities in existing approaches, and the intention is to build that more coherent foundation for theorizing, measuring, and applying the concept of social capital. And I think we're all fairly familiar. If you're working in this space, you're probably fairly familiar with the kinds of problems that we have. Current approaches have been pretty significantly criticized for being difficult to understand and communicate. And I certainly find that that's true when I'm trying to figure out what a particular author or scholar is talking about when they're talking about their definition of social capital. There's always questions that remain unanswered. And certainly when I'm talking with people outside of academia, there's a lot of questions. It's like, what do they even mean? There's also problems with it not being grounded in logic and theory. So not being clear whether it's the source, the form, the consequence that's being measured or that we're talking about, what it actually does, and why, I think is one of the key ones that keeps coming up again and again. What is the underlying theory that actually informs this? And I mentioned it's embedded with questionable assumptions, particularly in the measurement space. Now, of course, we need to use proxies or indicators to measure social capital, but quite often there's some pretty wild assumptions that are embedded in there, and they can take on a bit of a life of their own in the literature, where one researcher will use a particular proxy, and probably for good reason, perhaps the limitations of data availability or for any other number of other reasons. But then future researchers might pick that up and take it as fact and forget that there's actually some pretty significant assumptions involved there. And in general, it's been poorly suited to theory development because there isn't that kind of exploration of why and the underlying theory. And it's very unclear a lot of the time about the practical implementation and the policy recommendations that can come from social capital research, especially when it has these kinds of problems. So that's, I think, what we all understand the current problem to be. Many scholars, I think, in the social capital space are prepared to put their head in the sand, as it were, and to ignore these kinds of problems and just carry on. But if we're going to improve the usefulness of the concept and its potential to be transformative in the world and have practical implementations, then we need to address a lot of these. And that's what I've been working on for, well, at least 15 years, but probably the last 20 years since I abandoned the idea of doing empirical research with the concept back about 20 years ago. So therefore, what do we need to do? And I think really it's about looking for the similarities that exist rather than the differences between the different approaches. Because if nothing else, we're talking about something that is social and that is capital. So surely we're talking about something just about the same or that has some significant similarities, and we should be able to find ways to reconcile across that. And I think perhaps it's a lot like the parable of the blind men coming across the elephant. They're experiencing different parts of the same thing. If the blind man is seeing the side of the elephant, perhaps it's a wall. If it's a trunk, maybe it's a spear. If it's the tail, perhaps it's a rope. So perhaps we're just seeing different parts of the same thing, and we're just simply not able to see the big picture of how all these things fit together. And that's understandable because researchers are coming at this from different perspectives, different paradigms, different disciplines, different methodological requirements, different areas of interest. And so it's natural that they would see different parts of the whole, perhaps. But I'm really interested to see whether or not we can actually piece together a coherent whole from this. So a couple of comments about the paradigm itself, because I don't want to control the nature of social capital research. This work isn't intended to preference or exclude any theories. I want to bring everybody in and see how their work fits, and I want to respect and acknowledge the contribution that their work makes to the big picture and the whole. And so I don't want to limit the explanations of social capital and its outcomes in any way. And it's certainly not an attempt to create an operational definition of social capital. This is something that I'm asked repeatedly is this going to lead to a single definition of social capital that everybody can use? And I think, at least in the immediate future, the answer is no, because everybody is going to continue to see it a little bit differently. And I think that's actually good for now, at least. And we'll see what happens later. But what I hope it will do is do these kinds of things, encourage the theory building, the exploration of causality, the clarity of models, all of these important things that actually helps us to produce better research. And then when we do, we can then have greater insights in how we can apply this concept in practical interventions and in policy. So what have we done until now? Well, the focus really has been on exploring all of those claimed and implied and assumed logics of social capital. So for every meaning of the concept that exists in the literature, as best I can at least, there's hundreds, is to try and find how it relates to the capital nature of social capital and the potential for social action. And that's probably a good starting point to simply start with social and capital, because surely we can all agree that it has those two key properties. So what do we actually mean by that? And social certainly can have a lot of different ways of understanding it. It certainly relates to connections between people at the micro level. That's going to be social relationships and social interaction and exchange. But at the macro level, it might be the nature of social organization and social structure, the way in which we form institutions and develop rules and so forth that connect people. But it still has to do with how people are connected through these kinds of social relationships or social structures. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about capital because it's embedded with a lot of ideology coming from neoclassical economics, particularly, that says what it is and what it isn't. But at its core, it involves some sort of a potential ability or capacity. It's something that we can invest in with an expectation of return, and it permits increased production and outcomes in future. What this means is social capital is certainly not what it does. That is not how capital functions. Fundamentally, capital is something that produces a future return. Social capital is not something that it does. And we'll come back to that again later, which I think is a really important point as we establish the logic of social capital. So there is that question, why is it capital? And this is one that's been bouncing around in the literature for quite some time. People have seemed to have lost interest in it more recently. But it certainly is different from the classical theories of capital. Those theories have undergone expansion and modification over time. Traditionally, capital was physical capital and financial capital that basically enabled people to get future returns on their investment and basically increase wealth. So it was something for the capitalists. But over time, we acknowledge that there are other forms of capital as well. And one of the first to be acknowledged was that natural capital is a really important input in production, but it's also a form of capital in its own right because you can invest in forests and fisheries and you can protect them and they provide future benefits and returns and others as well. So natural capital was started to be acknowledged as a really important form of capital from the 1970s. And around the same time, it started to be acknowledged that capital is not just for the capitalists, that in actual fact, everyone has the ability to invest in themselves through their skills, their abilities and experience, so that's human capital, but also through their social relationships and position and standing within society, and that's social capital. I think that's the core meaning of capital is that it's that fundamental characteristic that it has a potential to do something. So we could talk about it as a potential that can produce a flow, like a stock that can produce a flow, to use kind of economic terminology, that it can yield productive services or benefits in the future, and that it can be used, that flow may be goods and services, it may create new stocks, it may transform stocks, but it's something that is productive, that can do something. I think this is very well established in the literature. Some of the scholars might try to dodge this by saying that it's a metaphor for capital, but that means it's at very least it's capital-like. So let's see what the literature has to say. And I think it supports this idea of it being a potential. It's something that facilitates, something that has expected returns, that can mobilize, that can facilitate. This comes up consistently again and again. And in the work that I've done talking with many hundreds of different scholars about this, everybody agrees. I don't think this is at all contentious, but it allows us to create a simple logic for how social capital functions based on this very simple idea about capital and how it functions. Because it's a process. So it's normally a byproduct, but it can be the result of investment. That's the enabling environment, that's the source, that creates this stock, this potential, this ability, this capacity to do something. And then it facilitates these outcomes, so some sort of a yield or return, and that flow may mobilize or activate or enhance other forms of capital. That's how capital functions, and this gives us a starting point, at least, for developing this ontology of social capital. So the next question, by the way, we haven't said at all what it is yet, except that it has the properties of being a potential. So let's move on and explore what it actually does. And this is the kind of stuff you see in the literature. It's vital, it's a glue, it's a lubricant, it allows people to work together. Okay, that's great. But what does it actually do? Can we get to some answers on this? And this question actually was surprisingly difficult to answer when I was exploring this some years ago. What I found was that these are the commonly cited examples, or these are the commonly cited things that social capital does. You know, cooperation, collective action, information flows, social introductions, social support, actions based on trust, reciprocity, and various helping, giving, caring types of actions. And I don't like lists because I'm always wondering, well, what else belongs in this list? What is the thing that actually groups these together? What is the superordinate that we're talking about here so we can understand why all of these different actions are related? And what I realize is that these are all social actions. These are all actions that relate to others. And so we could say then that social capital is something that facilitates, enables, or encourages these social actions. But we also need to think about the non-action outcomes of social capital, which is something that we've discovered from other forms of capital, such as natural capital, where we have use outcomes and non-use outcomes. We can log a forest, but we can also just have a forest there and we all feel good about it. And that also has those kinds of intrinsic benefits. So for social capital, that can be things like psychological well-being, mental health, happiness, those kinds of things can come from simply knowing that you have a supportive community, even if you're not actually activating and getting support from your community. So this is also very well supported from the literature. And again, I haven't found anybody that disagrees with this when I've talked about it with them. A lot of the definitions of social capital explicitly actually mention outcomes of social capital. You know, Coleman, for example, the actions of individuals is exactly what social capital does. Nan Lin's, a very famous book, A Theory of Social Structure and Action, was the subtitle of that book. And there's these kinds of examples as well that support what those findings that I was talking about. So therefore, we can modify our little logic schema of social capital, and we can add in that down the bottom here in the activation context that it doesn't just directly result in returns and yields. It actually influences or facilitates the actions of individuals that contributes towards these returns or yields. And I think this is really important because in the literature, it often talks about how social capital results in innovation. Well, hang on a second. Innovation requires a lot of other things other than social capital. And so, yes, social capital is important, and through the actions of individuals, it can contribute to innovation. But we also need perhaps physical capital, financial capital, human capital in order to have effective innovation. And so social capital is just one of those things that contributes towards these kinds of returns or yields that I've listed on this slide. So we're getting there. We still don't know what this capacity is. You know, we have this simple logic schema of capital, but this is the big question, and there's many different perspectives on what this potential actually is. And here are just a few, only a few from the literature. I think there's quite a lot more than this. You know, these are ideas about what the potential is, what social capital is. And sometimes it's one of these, sometimes it's many of these. And so we end up with this kind of confusing paradigm, if you like, where we kind of all agree that it's capital, investment or byproduct results in this thing we're talking about, and it produces future benefits and returns. But there's lots of ideas about what this potential is. And again, I don't like lists. So how can we try and organize these and make sense of them in a way that might help us to understand the logic of social capital? So that's the next big question, is how can we group these together and understand how each one of them potentially relates to that potential for social action, which is what social capital is all about. So as we discussed, there's many different ideas out there, but there seems to be two core components that it always comes down to. And I haven't been able to find a superordinate across these two core components, and you'll see why. I think this quote from Bob Putnam illustrates it quite nicely, where he says, "A society of many virtuous but isolated individuals is not necessarily rich in social capital." And we can see the two core components here, that we need people to be virtuous. So we need people to actually like each other, to care about each other, to be inclined to want to help each other. But we also need people to be connected, because if people are isolated, then there are limited opportunities and abilities to be able to engage in social action. So we need both of those things. We need connectedness, so that opportunity and ability. And I like the term predispositions. or you could say inclinations or intentions or motivations, but it captures that virtuous nature. We want people to like each other. We want people to be predisposed to want to help each other. And predispositions can take the form of values or attitudes, beliefs, emotions, understandings that influence the potential for social action and the nature of social action when it occurs. And I've listed here many of the types of values, attitudes, beliefs that are listed in the literature. Norms, goodwill, social identity, reputation. Well, there's lots of these. This isn't all of them. And I thought about, well, what do these all have in common? And really, they influence or they predispose people to act in certain ways. So I think that the umbrella or the superordinate of predispositions perhaps is a good way to think about it, because it isn't just an ongoing and never-ending list that's disconnected from what it does. We're very clear about what it does, and we're then able to consider the factors that are relevant, factors that maybe aren't relevant, and we may be able to actually add different predispositions to this list depending on the context that we're interested in. And then the other one, of course, is connectedness. And this is a very simple idea that if people are not connected, then they cannot call upon others. And then there can only be unplanned or incidental outcomes, regardless of people's predisposition for social action. So those opportunities for social action come from connectedness, both formal and informal, but also from knowing. Because when you think about it, if you don't know about other people, you don't know what they can do, what their reputation is, who they know, how they can help you, how you can help them. You don't know about their predispositions. You don't know about roles and policies. So there's a lot to know, which enables and activates that opportunity for social capital to occur. And that is part of the potential. It is part of that stock. And it's not often talked about, but it's clearly something that's important. So we can continue to develop up this logic schema of social capital. I've now added that this potential in the middle relates to predispositions and connectedness. And from the vast and extensive literature, we have a list of ideas on the right-hand side here about what those are. But before I carry on, we're developing our logic schema here as we go. I just wanted to touch on a really important quality of social capital. And that is that it's not universally accessible to everyone in a social grouping. And this is because every individual has different opportunities and abilities to create and utilize social capital based on a range of different criteria or qualities. So it may be earned or inherited commonalities. It may be the family you're born into. It may be your race. There's lots of things that you're simply inherited. But then you may also earn certain commonalities with others. You might go to a certain university, you might take a certain qualification or a degree or a position, or you might obtain fame or something that you earn. And then there is also various preconceptions and stereotypes, or where they're negative, of course, prejudices that mean different people have different opportunities to build and use social capital. And then there's also lots of different individual characteristics and preferences and competencies. Some people are naturally incredibly social and able to build relationships very, very easily, and others find it more difficult and perhaps don't have the same competencies, or perhaps they don't want to. Their individual characteristics are as such. And of course, as Pierre Bourdieu highlighted very importantly for us, that the ownership and access to other forms of capital also shapes our ability to build and use social capital. So I talked about the the process of social capital as it's forming in the enabling environment and being activated in the activation context. And I wanted to just touch on each of those briefly because I think it's really important to talk about how social capital comes about. So this enabling environment facilitates or enables the creation of the social capital, of the stock. And the primary driver of social capital formation is social action. And what we mean really is social interaction, communication, where people talk with each other, they form relationships, they develop trust, they refine and redefine norms, and so on and so forth. This all happens through social action. And this enabling environment involves at least two or parts or functions. You have the social infrastructure, the actual physical space, if you like, or the digital space. It's the architecture for opportunity in which this interaction or social action can occur. But we also have the rules of engagement as well, the roles, the procedures, the rules about how you can and can't interact with others in a particular space. And these two things together shape the ability, the opportunity for people to be able to interact and form social capital, and also their inclination to do so, and even the way in which and their attitude towards others is shaped by this enabling environment. In a very pleasant and peaceful space, people likely want to interact with others and form positive relationships. In a noisy, abrupt, uncomfortable environment, people may not be so inclined to form positive relationships in the same kinds of ways. So this is really, really important because the social capital actions, when we think about it, they need to these social actions they need to leave a stock if we're going to have something for the future, a future benefit or return if we're going to produce social capital. So clearly, pro-social, positive social action leaves a stock. Transactional action, however, leaves little or no stock. And clearly, exploitive kinds of actions leave no stock and even barriers for future as well. And we can use different terms to describe each of these kind of three broad categories of different social actions. But clearly, if we want to form social capital in the enabling environment, we need more pro-social actions that can actually leave a stock, can actually develop this capital. And of course, what matters is perception. It doesn't matter so much what the intention is, it's how it's actually interpreted. Sometimes the best of intentions are perceived to be negatively. And of course, then if that's the case, you're not developing a stock of social capital for the future. And the activation context is that environment that facilitates or enables the activation for the outcomes to occur. And it also involves social infrastructure and governance. But the key thing here is that many outcomes involve mobilizing, activating, enhancing, and transforming other forms of capital. Not all outcomes, but many of them. And therefore, it has limited capacity in the absence of these other forms of capital, particularly physical and human capital. And so we need to think about that. We need to think about the nature of our activation context, whether it's actually able to produce the outcomes that we're interested in. And so often this activation, enabling environment, activation context are actually the same environment. And it's often incredibly dynamic. It changes very rapidly as a result of context and circumstances as things happen. But it's useful to consider that dual role of enabling and activating because an environment may be effective at enabling social capital, but it may be ineffective at activating it. And the simplest example is simply an absence of other kinds of resources and capital to be mobilized. So it's worth thinking this through and the dual function of these environments. And this demonstrates how the stock must be linked to its activation. This is the thing about social capital is we must link it to its ability to do something. That's part of this concept that we're talking about. It's not merely trust, it's actually the ability to do something with that in future, for it to be activated. And that's a really important point. It's not just goodwill, it's not just solidarity, it's the opportunity to produce the outcomes. That's what capital is all about. So just a reminder of our logic schema, we've just been talking about the enabling environment, which is so fundamental to creating social capital, and of course the activation context, which is also fundamental if we're ever going to produce any kind of outcomes or future returns from it. So we're nearly there with this logic schema, but there's one more point that I want to get to before we look to what this really means. That is that it's not just individuals who can invest in their relationships. An individual can build and use their social capital. And I say their in quotation marks because it's not really theirs. It's actually their social capital resides in others and how they think and feel about them. Think about it. If you want to get a favor, have someone do something for you, it's not about what you think. It's about what they think of you. That's what would enable the activation of this favor or this social introduction or the outcomes of social capital. But all the same, an individual can certainly build and use their social capital, but so can an organization or a community can build and use their social capital. And another way to think about it is that individuals are influenced by their immediate social relationships, but individual action is also influenced by the wider social structures, culture, norms, social trust at that community or organizational level as well. So we can explore then across the nature of connectedness. Typically, what we're thinking about is we're thinking about individual social relationships. So this is the individual properties of connectedness. But there's also collective properties of connectedness because we're connected by structures, by groups, by organizations. There's different leadership capacities and roles and procedures within those organizations and structures. And that is also a really important way of connecting people that creates or enables this kind of opportunity and ability that we're talking about with social capital. And then on the predisposition side, or inclinations side, or cognitive perhaps, depending on the terminology you like to use, the quality of the individual relationships is clearly important. If I like John, I'm more likely to help John if I have goodwill with him. These are the individual properties of relationships that build up through experience with one another. But there are also these collective properties, social trust, these wider social norms, obligations and expectations that form at the collective level that also shapes the nature of social action towards one another. So therefore, we can update our schema here, rather than it just being connectedness and predispositions in the middle, the nature of the capacity, ability, potential. We can add the individual and the collective properties in there as well. And on the right-hand side, I've updated it, just simply separating them out into these different aspects at different levels. And all of these are important, of course, and we can see how different actors are able to influence different aspects of this process of social capital. Now, clearly, individuals are the primary driver of the individual level properties. They're the ones who are forming the relationships and the quality of those relationships and acting with others, and they're the powerhouse, of course, of changing those individual properties of social capital. But organizations and coordinating institutions, particularly through their leadership, through their policies, through the nature of the enabling environment and activation context that they create, they are the primary change agents of those aspects of the process. It's difficult for an individual to shape the enabling environment powerfully. Well, unless, of course, they're a leader of an organization or a group or a coordinating institution. And then, of course, they can do it. But an individual acting alone has limited ability to be able to influence many aspects of social capital beyond their own individual relationships. And so it's really worth thinking about, okay, so for organizations, they have this opportunity, they have this ability to be able to so significantly influence these critical parts of the social capital process to produce significant and meaningful outcomes and change. Now, I was suggested in the beginning that this is an ontology. This isn't a conceptual framework. I haven't been specific about what any of these things are. This simply can guide how the existing understandings and approaches to social capital fit within what I think here is the big picture of how social capital actually functions. And so, for example, I'd like to take the common distinction of bonding and bridging social capital and look at how these different ideas fit within this schema or this ontology of social capital. So on the right here, I have some of the different ways in which bonding and bridging is defined. It's not consistent in the literature by any means, but generally speaking, bonding is inward looking. It tends to be strong ties with people who are alike, involving thick trust, network closure. These are the kinds of ideas that are associated with bonding, social capital. Bridging, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite. Outward looking, weak ties, people who are different, thin trust, and structural holes. So we can take something like people who are alike or people who are different. This is the idea of homophily, which is very often talked about in bonding and bridging social capital. Not always. It's often used as a proxy for measuring bonding and bridging social capital. And we can see this relates to the nature of relationships with people who are alike or relationships with people who are different from yourself. And then this is very commonly, we think of social bonding as helping to get by or to get ahead. Well, this relates to the types of capitals that we're likely to get access to, or types of resources we're likely to get access to as a result of these different types of relationships that we have within society, or communities, of course, that are inward looking, are going to be a little bit limited in the types of or variety of resources they have access to, whereas communities that are outward looking are more likely to get access to different types of capitals and resources and ideas and opportunities. And so this is the general idea. And then something like thick trust, thin trust is often associated with these different types, if you like, or functions of social capital. And we can see that that sits here. Thick trust exists within relationships, so that's an individual property of social capital, whereas thin trust exists at the collective level, and therefore it's a shared predisposition. So we can start to map these different theories and ways of thinking about and understanding social capital against the processes that are actually involved. And we can do the same thing for another very popular conceptualization of social capital, which distinguishes between the structural, relational, and cognitive dimensions. So on the right-hand side, again, I have here listed the common aspects of each of these three dimensions. If we start with structural, network ties, configuration, roles, rules, precedents, procedures, we can see that's all about connectedness. And in fact, the two dot points on the right actually relate to individual and collective properties, respectively, at least in some way. Relational, then, about trust, trustworthiness, norms, relations, obligations, identity, and identification. Relational is about the nature of individual social relationships. So we can see it right here in the logic schema. And cognitive, the shared language, the shared codes, the shared values, and so forth. All they're very clearly shared predispositions. Now, they don't fit exactly perfectly, and perhaps the logic schema, this ontology, could help to refine this idea and the way we think about these different dimensions of social capital. So these are just a couple of examples. In the interest of time, I won't go any further, but I think we can see how just about any understanding of social capital, any way of measuring it, can be overlaid over this ontology of social capital, and we can see how it relates to the big picture and how it's contributing and understanding to that particular context. So I think that if we move on, I want to talk about some key insights. There's a lot of potential insights coming out of this. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but I'll give you three slides of different ideas. And I think this is a work in progress as the social capital field continues to engage with this. We can refine it and improve it and see where we can develop more meaning and understanding of social capital. But I think the core logic that I've outlined, so far at least, I haven't found anybody who disagrees with it. And I think that everybody probably should, because it's fundamental to the nature of capital and the way that these things work. And people also seem to be indicating that this is a really useful way to think about it because they can see the bigger picture of how it all fits together. But I think one of the biggest opportunities is the opportunity to bring in insights from across all of the social sciences to integrate into this ontology. Each aspect that I described has a really rich and complicated picture that can be informed by psychology and anthropology and economics. And like every discipline can contribute understanding to each part of this process. Just consider the enabling environment itself. There's already a considerable literature on social infrastructure. There's enormous insights to come from geography and from architecture and from the way in which physical space and digital space can influence and shape the nature of social interaction. So there's a lot of insights that can be integrated into this ontology. And by having a logic schema there, having a foundation we know where to bring them in and how they fit into the big picture of what we're talking about. But this illuminates the numerous ways that we can influence social capital. And really, if you think about it, any comprehensive implementation of social capital would consider all of the relevant aspects. We can shape the nature of the enabling environment. We can shape the nature of social relationships, the quality of those relationships, the nature of social structures. That we can shape the culture, those wider shared predispositions, and we can shape the nature of the activation context. So this illuminates a lot of potential opportunities and insights in how we can intervene to improve social capital in any particular context. And it's incredibly rich and complicated, but we have a framework for understanding how we can take different kinds of actions to achieve the outcomes we're looking for. I think that that point that everybody has different abilities and opportunities to build and use social capital needs to be said again and again. There has been a tendency in the past to universalize and see social capital as just something that's good that everybody can access, but that's not the case, as we've highlighted. And quite often, digging into what these different natures of connectedness and predispositions, how they manifest for different people, can identify how we might be able to change that to improve outcomes for certain sectors of a particular group or society or the population. I think another really important point is that the stock must be linked to its activation. You know, if there is limited potential for future action, then there is limited social capital. And so we talk about these key parts being, you know, building relationships and being connected, but also predispositions, you know, liking each other, being inclined to want to help each other or work together in future. But we need the mechanisms in there. That connectedness part needs to include the opportunity. You know, if two people meet, they get along, they really like each other, and then they go their separate ways and they have no way to contact each other, no way to reconnect, no way to activate social capital. There's limited social capital there. It would require an incidental interaction of those two actors in order to activate social capital. So there isn't much potential. And we need to try to understand and build this into the way in which we think about social capital. As a theory, it then starts to feel like it involves two almost conflicting or different parts. You know, this was a point that was made by Alejandro Portes, where he talked about how social capital has these multiple dimensions and they're different than each other. And those different dimensions clearly are the connectedness, which brings about those opportunities and abilities, and the predispositions. But as a form of capital, it's vital that we consider both of them. And I haven't talked about it much, or at all, really, but social capital can produce both positive and negative outcomes, and often simultaneously. And we can see how, because not everyone has the same opportunity and ability, sometimes there's positive outcomes for some actors or some people and negative outcomes for others. But we need to be aware that capital is inherently distinct from its use. You know, for example, human capital, you could learn a lot of skills. It could be used for good or it could be used for bad. You could make a bomb, you could commit terrorism, you could hurt others with your human capital. Same with physical capital. A hammer can be used to build a house or as a weapon. So capital is inherently distinct from its use, and we need to develop that understanding within social capital, because we need to understand what it does and how it can produce different kinds of outcomes. Another insight, I think, is that we often think about social capital of just purely like how much of something good is there without thinking about the downsides, the weaknesses, the barriers, the challenges, the threats that act upon different aspects of social capital. And I think with this ontology, we can then start to see and identify what they are and how they might manifest and how they might impact social capital. And therefore, of course, what we can do to try to mitigate them or reverse them or to avoid them in the first place. The next insight is an interesting one, which is that social capital is not one thing that does one thing. This is a very obvious point. The nature of connectedness and predispositions that helps a real estate agent to be incredibly effective in their job is different than the nature of connectedness and predispositions that, say, improves mental health. Or another example could be that leads to or facilitates innovation. So there is a tendency to see social capital as one thing, just simply measure it. There it is. We measure it the same every time, regardless of what the outcome is that we're interested in. And using examples from other forms of capital, that's like trying to measure the medical capacity of a particular city by measuring the number of years of education without actually measuring the number of years of medical education. or medical experience, because clearly a number of years of education as an engineer doesn't help you to perform surgeries, it doesn't help you to be a good medical doctor. So we need to understand that it's not one thing that does one thing. And the second point here is that it can be really useful, particularly in practical interventions, to start with the desired outcomes and work backwards. Okay, so you want innovation. So what actions of individuals are going to help to facilitate innovation? Okay, so you know what actions of individuals, maybe it's social introductions, maybe it's information sharing. Okay, what nature of connectedness and predispositions will therefore shape those specific actions of individuals you're looking for. And you can be much more purposeful and deliberate. You can address collective action problems. You can avoid negative outcomes. You can avoid loss of this vital form of capital when you're more aware of this big picture of how social capital functions right the way through from its enabling environment to its activation context. And just in case you forgot, that's dynamic. Of course, often it's the same environment and it's the same social actions that are both creating and resulting in outcomes of social capital at the same time. So just about at the end, what we then have effectively is these pillars of the paradigm, if you like, these short statements that everybody just about agrees with. These can start to help shape the nature of how we go about conducting research and interventions and policy with social capital, and to develop this rich ontological understanding of how it functions that can inform the way in which we use the concept. But there are challenges, and I wanted to highlight these, that while we find general agreement about all of this, it's only after some discussion or clarification, and there's different terminology, different framing, different reasoning. There's a lot to unpack and explore. This isn't easy, and it's required and quite honestly taken me thousands, if not tens of thousands of hours, and talking with hundreds of people and reading thousands of articles to try to get to the point where we are now. And fundamentally, it requires an openness. It requires all scholars and practitioners and policymakers to be happy to have these conversations, to explore different framing and different language to try to understand different people's perspective. I'm not an economist, but I've spent a good part of the last 4 years talking with Professor Lennon Robertson, who is an economist, and I've tried really hard to understand his language and him to understand mine, and it's been incredibly productive in doing so. And I also wanted to highlight that there are questions that remain unanswered. There are still tensions and difficulties and things that don't quite fit. There's still a lot to learn and understand about this. But here is an ontology that we can use to hopefully build on and move forward. So the way forward, well, we need widespread contributions and engagement. And I'd encourage everybody to engage with these kinds of ideas and help to refine them, see where their work fits in and how we can build a richer picture of this elephant, the whole part. We want to see the whole part of the elephant, not just the little bits that we're working on. And if we can do that, then we should be able to improve comparability, replicability, and implementation. We might be able to start developing tools and standards for measurement and application and publication. We might be able to stop the hackademia. This is Professor Ben Fine's term for hack academia, which is what's unfortunately happened a little bit in social capital, in the literature, and also the ad hoc applications of the concept. Just simply establishing social groups, okay, that can be effective because that can lead to the formation of relationships and relational qualities and so on and so forth. But it's also a bit ad hoc. It's not looking at more purposefully and deliberately how can we intervene and understand all of the different parts of the whole system, which of course is going to produce far better outcomes when we do. So this is extensively based on the literature. I'll share these slides afterwards. I don't expect you to be able to read all the references, but if you want to look things up, you're welcome to do so. And of course, always welcome for you to get in touch with me and to explore these ideas and how we might be able to refine and improve them and then use them. I think that's what this is all about. So yeah, thank you very much. Open to questions and discussion. We have around about 40 minutes in total now. If you can stay that long, of course, if you have to drop off, that's no problem at all. So what I'd like to do is invite you either to raise your hand, which you'll find under the React button within Zoom, Or alternatively, you can simply post in the chat. If you're not in a position to read out the question yourself, I can read it out on your behalf. Make sure you let me know in the chat so I know to read it out. So I haven't been looking at the chat, so let me have a quick look, see if there's anything in there already. Yes, you can get access to the presentation slides. Zabir, our team identifies the rules of engagement as institutions. Yeah, I think that there's different terminology here I think we can use in different kinds of contexts. So is it Gwen? I think you have your hand raised. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for a fascinating presentation. Very relevant to what I am doing, so I will be in touch separately. But a couple of pointers. One is the Cambridge have got a program, democratizing education program, where people who are, excuse me, people who are accepted are get scholarships. They do not expect any particular education preparation, but one of their courses is the wealth economy. And I will send you that information. They'll be starting, they've actually just opened applications for that. And one of the benefits is that you can become an ambassador for the course. So they really are looking to roll this out at ground level, but I'll send you that information if you're not aware of it. The other point is that coming out of the, my background is information, market access, supply chain, all of that sort of stuff. And the climate change and the focus of, for instance, the Paris Agreement on Indigenous rights, restoring Indigenous rights, protecting Indigenous rights, goes right into what you're talking about. And if we look, I'm in the Western Cape, if you look at South Africa as an example, you into your whole anti-colonialism, you into all of those changes from a political point of view. So what you are doing is absolutely vital. And my focus is ground level up, not top down. And it would be really good to take it further with you. So I just wanted to raise those to see if you're aware of them. And yeah, absolutely relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. And I don't know that I am aware of the Cambridge program. So yes, do please send me the details. There seems to be an enormous number of initiatives going on around the world right now that are related to social connection. They might not be using the term social capital, but they're really talking about the same thing. And when I think and have thought deeply about what is it that we're trying to achieve with social capital, it's really we're trying to reconnect with the importance of being social and how valuable and important that is for us. In many societies that have become individualistic and competitive and focus on self-reliance and started to underappreciate or undervalue the importance of social relationships. Like we all know about it in our personal lives. We can see it unplaying right before us. We can reflect on for ourselves how fundamentally important it's been for our lives. I could tell you about different jobs that I only received because of people I knew, and on and on and on. The outcomes and the importance for us, for individuals and for groups and communities is so obvious. And yet, as a society, and so many organizations, institutions, governments seem to have kind of lost track of that. And the concept of social capital, from my point of view, is one of the ways in which we can reconnect with that.
No, it certainly is vital, and they do refer to that. The wealth economy is challenging the whole financial aspect, saying that is not the only economy. So I will be in touch, but thank you. You've saved me a huge amount of understanding, if you like, or work. Much appreciated.
No, my pleasure. We've got Zabir has a hand up, and then we'll go to Tim after that. Is it Zabir? Zabir?
Zabir is fine, but team, if you
Zabir.
want, like, ask the question first. I saw your camera switching on, but please go ahead.
Thanks. I can't find put my hand up button, so please excuse me for that. Thank you, Tristan. I really do appreciate that. Yeah, comprehensive presentation. I've done some research recently looking at the way that local communities can benefit from their relationships with associates, individuals who are working at a distance, I guess, and benefit from the wisdom, experience, insights, etc., that the collective gains from others. As I was thinking about that, I came across an article that was written quite a long time ago, which I'm sure you're aware of, that was by Fulkerson and Thompson, where they sort of did a sort of analysis of a heap of literature and the way that the language was of social capital was being used. They broke it down into these two categories of sort of normative social capital and resource social capital, which I found helpful in thinking about how communities benefit from the sort of resources, I guess, that they gain from their connections to individuals. I was just wondering if you can explain how that. What do you see value in the sort of resource normative, or how do those concepts relate to the sort of ontology that you've explained for us?
I would say there's two different focuses on where they see the mechanisms or the capital existing within that ontology. So the normative approach focuses obviously on the nature of the predispositions, particularly on the norms, but also on the trust. If you think about what norms and trust are, is they're just inclinations or predispositions for how we relate with others. And so they focus on that. That is what the capital is. Whereas the resource approach kind of shifts the focus down towards the activation context. And it says that social capital is actually more about the ability to mobilize resources. And there's a danger there where it starts to get into calling other forms of capital social capital when it's mobilized, which then creates a paradox, which is then obviously not a great thing for doing any kind of academic work. But I think the concern from a practical implementation point of view is it starts to separate the mechanisms from the focus. If we're focusing on the existence of these resources and then being mobilized, we're not understanding how and why they're being mobilized. And so I think it's just purely that these different conceptual approaches focus on different parts of the system, if you like, of the process that's involved in social capital. And a really interesting exercise is to do something like take the 6 dimensions of social capital from the OECD, for example, back in like 2001. And what you find is that these 6 different dimensions actually fit anywhere from the enabling environment to different aspects of connectedness and predispositions, and in fact relate to outcomes specifically. And so back then there wasn't this kind of logic, there wasn't this kind of ontology that had been developed. So they knew these things were important. They were including them as dimensions, but they didn't have a way to see how they fit together and contributed towards the overall outcome.
Right. So the resource lens is kind of focusing on sort of one particular element, and particularly the sort of the outcomes of it. Is that sorry if I'm misunderstanding,
Yeah. So the typical definition from the resource approach is something along the lines of resources embedded in social networks that are mobilized through purposeful actions. That's Nan Lin's definition, or it might be even more specifically resources mobilized in social networks. So it's focused, as you can see, it's focused on these outcomes, the ability to mobilize resources. And it gets to eventually, of course, it has to get to, well, what are the mechanisms that actually result in the mobilization? And typically they say it's networks that does the mobilizing, but they may not go any further than that. They may not, and the literature is incredibly broad, so I don't want to be painting one picture here. But there is a tendency to say, it is the resources, it's mobilized by networks, and then not actually get into the mechanisms of how and why networks mobilize resources. Whereas I think the more comprehensive picture that I've painted shows how there's different reasons and pieces to this. You need the connectedness, you need the predispositions. There's lots of different predispositions that shape the mobilization of resources, basically, because that is a lot of what we're talking about as outcomes is mobilization. I would add activation, enhancement, transformation to mobilizing. But that's what a lot of it is like, I have information, I share it with you. Well, that's activating my human capital and mobilizing it across our network to share it with you. So that is an outcome of social capital. And many of the outcomes of social capital are mobilizing, activating, transforming different forms of capital. But importantly, not all of them.
Yes, right. Just one final follow-up, and sorry, this is just a point of clarification. You said early on that, well, you said a number of times, social capital is not what it does. Can you just explain that phrase a little more?
Certainly, yep. What I've done quite consistently here is I've looked and looked at examples from other forms of capital, because social capital is a form of capital. It has similarities with other forms of capital, and I think it really helps to understand the logic. So the analogy that I'd use is a factory is physical capital. It's manufacturing capital. It produces shoes, for example. The manufacturing capital is not the shoes. It's the ability to make the shoes. It's the factory. So social capital fundamentally is a potential to do something. It's not the outcomes that it produces.
Right. So it doesn't just produce social connectedness. Is that what you mean? It works beyond that.
Well, social connectedness is the potential.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Which,
and you're focusing on what that connectedness produces, in a sense.
So yes. So
what flows from that.
So social connectedness is both the potential and it's an intrinsic outcome of the potential as well. So this is where it starts to get a little bit dynamic and a bit confusing. We're saying belonging and identity and social connectedness is a good thing because it produces all these kinds of outcomes. One of the good things that it produces is effectively mental well-being, physical well-being, and so forth, because of connectedness, not because of action, not because of mobilizing resources, just purely because someone can sit in their apartment and feel connected to their community. There's benefits there. There's ongoing future returns there from the connectedness that exists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you. That's been really helpful. Yeah.
Pleasure. Sabir, feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you so much. And my name is Zabir Hassan. I'm an assistant scientist in Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in the Department of International Health. And I started dabbling with social capital back in my master's when I looked into like coping strategy for catastrophic health expenditure, and I really dive into social capital during my thesis. And the work that I did was in northern India, and one of the biggest challenges that I faced is the whole ontology and how it's translate in other languages. And if you look at the literature, mostly written in English, and conceptualization, though it's like a universal ideas and universal thoughts, but the writing and the literatures are mostly in English and some in Japanese also. But when you really go locally, either in Africa or in Southeast Asia, working with other researcher or communicating, trying to communicate and capture those construct, because you have to do a survey, you have to do a qualitative interview, that becomes very complicated, because it just because of the language, because of the nuances, and even sitting hours and hours and talking about it. So that actually leads to the whole idea that you talked about, like academia, because there are like 30-40 construct, and should I just measure trust and get by saying that, okay, this is the social capital of this village? I think that actually very dangerous, that you mentioned that the real energy. I really liked it about the amount of education. It's not the education for the medical provider versus everyone. So that's one. Just it's a comment, not a question. But the second question, second part of my uh, I was thinking about is when you're talking about mobilization of the resources, and resources can be anything, and resources can also be informations, right? So this is I'm thinking for the last few years that information as a resource is fundamentally different than other type of resources. And as we are getting connected more digitally, and a lot of those resources are depending on while activation, but through information. And if the information is something we are mobilizing, how that fundamentally changes the framework of social capital itself. Because when you're thinking about like money or some kind of in-kind help, is totally different than how information is being shared. And for me also, information is like a bullet. Like once it is out of you've spoken about it, or you send a WhatsApp message, it creates its own dynamics, right? A lot of time you don't have control over it compared to other type of resource you have control over it. So yeah, so what are your thought about this whole information technology revolution that is still happening and evolving very, very fast? How that can affect the logic of social capital that you just presented. And thank you. I really like the presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'll start with your second question, because I think that the changes in technology are clearly going to result in changes in the way that people interact and exchange, the way in which we form social connection, the way in which we form community. So there are undoubtedly going to be changes, and everyone that I'm talking to at the moment is talking about AI, because of course that's already starting to fundamentally change the way in which people are interacting with each other and the nature of that interaction. So I think that nothing will fundamentally change about the ontology, and the ontology can simply provide the framework, if you like, or the way to understand how these things are changing. That if we're finding more of the information we're looking for from digital electronic sources without going to people and asking them for input, then we can see how that's changing the nature of the social interaction, and therefore the nature of social connection and the way in which social capital forms, in ways that may end up being significant. Or they may not, because we might be getting our information from Google or from AI, but we're still going to people in our lives for our social needs, to interact, to get emotional support, to talk about the world, to get input. So it may not shift things considerably. So I think there's a lot there that we can unpack about what's happening and the way it's changing the enabling environments, the activation context, the nature of connectedness, and so on and so forth. But I think one of the key things about the information sharing is that it's not just sharing information. It's often sharing skills. It's often sharing advice. And advice isn't just information. It's loaded with what you could describe as attachment value, as in it's not just the value of the information, it's where it's coming from as well, and whether you trust that source or you feel like you should act on that because of where it's coming from. And so the resources you could briefly describe as information is actually much more varied than just simply facts and figures. And the way of understanding social capital that I've outlined is then capable of understanding all those different kinds of outcomes. And I want to talk a little bit more about this idea about resources and the resource approach, coming back to the earlier question and comment about the resource approach to social capital, is that when you try and understand what they mean by resources, there's rarely a definition. It's rarely explicit. Now, if you go back to Nan Lin, now, his work prior to social capital was on social resource theory. He had a rich body of work prior to social capital coming around that he then effectively rebranded as social capital, focused on social resources. So social resources originally for Nan Lin was power and influence and the introductions that you could make. These were social resources that could be mobilized in networks. Makes a lot of sense. And it's quite consistent, I think, with the ontology. But what people since have added is that social capital as social resources actually is human capital, physical capital, and so forth, which then results with the kind of incongruences and paradoxes that I mentioned. So there's often not a definition of what resources mean. But when we're talking about the outcomes, like if we're mobilizing, activating, enhancing, well, then it's anything that we can mobilize, activate, enhance. It's a tractor that you could loan to a neighbor. It's a cup of sugar you could give to a neighbor. It's a friend who needs some information or some guidance. Like there's a lot of different ways in which these resources, broadly speaking, could be mobilized or activated. And if I can just go back to your first comment as well, I'm often asked, how is social capital different in different cultural contexts? And I say, well, it is fundamentally different in the way in which people connect, in the nature of the norms, in so many things are fundamentally different, but everything else is kind of fundamentally the same. The way that the need people have to form connections, to form social groupings, the belonging, the identity, the trust, like all of those things are consistent at that fundamental level. It's just the way in which they're manifest is different in different contexts. And I think there does end up being a significant challenge. And you highlighted taking academic terminology and trying to apply it in different cultural contexts being challenging. I think the same applies even in the same cultural context, because these academic concepts, the academic terms, don't often mean a lot to people. And so even the way we design surveys, you've got to crack through that. You've got to find the way in which people understand the information we're actually looking for. And that clearly is going to be more difficult in other cultural contexts, but in different language contexts, but it's still the same kind of thing that we need to break through and we need to do in every context. But I do really strongly think that the overall ontology is consistent across all cultural contexts, because humans are not actually all that different when it comes down to social connection, belonging, trust, identity, and so forth. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have any follow-ups on that.
No, but thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Okay, we still have a little bit of time if anybody else has any questions. Remember, if you aren't in a position to talk yourself, you can post in the chat. Just let me know and I can read it out on your behalf. Otherwise, you can simply raise your hand or even unmute yourself and ask any kind of question you have. I realize I certainly covered a lot of ground in that presentation.
I'll come back if nobody else is burning to ask a question, Tristan, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, if someone else wants to jump in, please kick this question along. But I guess I'm just interested to hear your reflections on the idea that I've sort of identified, but on kind of these local communities. So I guess a collective having social connections with individuals elsewhere. I guess I'm just trying to understand where you talked about the individual and collective entities. Is it reasonable to talk about social capital being formed between a collective and an individual, or is that kind of apples and oranges?
This is where it gets complex, because does the collective exist separately from the individuals that make it up? And the answer is both yes and no, because the collective has those intersubjective properties, if you like. It has shared norms and shared trust and shared identity and so forth that exist separate to the individuals, but also part of the individuals. And so is it possible for an individual to have a relationship with a different social entity that they're not part of? Maybe. But they're far more likely to have relationships with other individuals or actors within that other social grouping. But I think the integration of the individual and the collective perspectives, to me, it's the recognition that our actions, because that's what we're talking about, individual actions, that's what social capital does, that's the outcome. Our actions are influenced by our social relationships, by the people who we know and the nature of those relationships. Like Tim, you and I now know each other now, we're developing goodwill and trust with each other. So that influences the nature of my actions towards you. But my actions are also influenced by the wider social setting, by laws, by culture, by social trust, by broader social norms. If you and I walk into a library, my actions are going to be influenced by the norms of the library, which is a collective norm. as much as it's going to be influenced by our relational norms or our relational properties as well. So when we recognize that action is influenced by both levels, by the collective and by the individual, we can see how both levels play a role in shaping our understanding of social capital.
Right. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So when an individual comes into contact with a community of people, even if that, then in a sense, it's you're looking at how they become a part of that collective, effectively, is it? Rather than like standing outside it, I suppose.
Yeah. I think this is an interesting line of questioning, because social capital fundamentally is about how we're connected with others. If we don't have something that connects us, whether it's a commonality or shared interest or shared needs, or if there's not something that connects us, then it's hard to see how social capital exists there. Again, coming back to the nature of human action, like we're talking about action that is social in nature. So social action requires something that connects us for me to want to do something for you in a way that is positive. And so I think what you're talking about there is, yeah, an individual who somehow feels connected to this, what was before an other community. They weren't part of it, but maybe they feel connected to it in some way. Maybe they're not part of it, they don't belong, but there's something that connects them. Interconnected well-being, interconnected values, something that connects them, some commonality, something.
Yeah. So in this case, it was sort of people working towards similar goals, similar values, similar belief systems, but geographically quite separate. And so there's kind of these connections that happen across the miles, in a sense, that how does that influence the collective when they have these connections with individuals at a distance? But there's a social connectedness that happens there. Yeah. But maybe is it better to think about the connections between the individuals within the collective and the individual that's at a distance?
Not if you're talking about belonging and identity, no. Because like in that context, what connects them is the connection or the identity to the other collective. And so like I think that this is a really, really good line of questioning, because there is an assumption in much of the literature that social capital requires a personal connection, requires a network. You need to know somebody in order to get the outcomes of social capital to be activated, or for social capital to exist. But clearly that's not the case when you think about something like holding doors open for people, giving a stranger directions, so many actions that occur within society that are clearly pro-social actions as the result of some sort of a potential stock between strangers. And so it's what I would say is those actions between strangers, okay, they're strangers, they don't know each other personally, but they feel connected in some way. They're part of the same community, the same group. There's some way, something that connects them there that results in the kind of empathy or predispositions that shapes the nature of those actions.
Yeah. Thank you. Helpful. Thanks for, yeah.
I think it's a great area to continue to explore, because this is kind of the under-theorized part of what social capital is, that it's often just taken as its networks, its norms, but without actually exploring, well, why and how does it function and how are people connected and what is actually influencing the nature of people's actions. And my hope is that this ontology very explicitly shows how it's a process enabling environment activation context, but it also very explicitly talks about how it's the actions of individuals. So we're interested in that fundamental question, why are humans cooperative? And many different disciplines can contribute many different understandings to it. Cognitive neuroscience can contribute to it. Economics can contribute to it, like psychology. And these are the questions that you're asking. These are the connections between people. Why are people acting cooperatively? And they're the mechanisms that we need to understand if we're going to understand the research context or if we're going to make interventions in practice and policy.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think Gwen had a hand up first, and then we'll go, there's a question in the chat from Brad, and we have about 10 minutes left just in terms of a time check.
Right. Excuse me, just a quick point. cooperation and collaboration. And I'm getting caught up in that, including at a contractual level. If we're looking at communities collaborating in different entities, which is different to cooperative production, as an example. And one of the considerations is youth and the impact of access to goodness knows what all in social media. Every kid has got a cell phone, and that generational impact is particularly visible in your rural communities, where you have a tradition of the elders and you have the youth coming through, and the gap between them is huge. So that, from a social capital perspective, is something else that we, I look forward to exploring this further. But I just wanted to bring that into the picture.
And I think what you're talking about there, that increasing social divide because of increasingly different experiences of life, like this is a threat to social capital.
Yeah.
Because it's driving that wedge that's decreasing the connectedness, that's resulting in fewer shared predispositions and different perspectives of thinking and acting, which then obviously is impairing the potential for social action. And we tend to see this across generations, where generational change occurs and there are those connections across the generations aren't maintained in the same kinds of ways. We can see it on socioeconomic grounds, we can see it on education grounds, we can see it on ethnicity or on gender diversity. There's all sorts of ways in which divides can occur within a social grouping. And we can understand then from the ontology how it's shaping the nature of connectedness and predispositions across those divides in ways that are often not at all productive for social capital.
Agreed. Not only not productive, but not understood. If you look at the young kids, and I don't know, what's it, 7 or 8 or what have you, by the time the brain has started to mature. If you look at what the young kids are absorbing, that connection is scary. And very often the use, if I put on my data recording activity hat, there's no discipline or little discipline in the use of, for instance, data. So authenticity becomes an issue and so on. So, but yeah, I just wanted to bring in collaboration as opposed to cooperation. We need both, but also the generational divide.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. And just on cooperation, there's 2 dictionary definitions of cooperation. One is to accommodate others, and the other one is to work together effectively with others.
Yeah.
And they're quite different types of social action. This is one of the exercises I went through is, we're talking about social action. What does that mean? Is it every action that we could possibly conduct that is related to others? Clearly working together is, clearly accommodating other people's needs is. Then we get to, well, action that is influenced by others, not directly related to or impacting others, less sure, but that's getting into the space of common property resources, graffiti, managing forestry, clean air and water and so forth. And then you get into the just action that is influenced by others completely indirectly. And then we're getting into, say, public health space and so forth, which it's not clear that all of those ways.
Yeah, where I'm coming from is cooperation in order to achieve more. So if you look at a community and you've got food gardens, when they want to move into retail, you need standards, all the rest of it. So it's that level of cooperative, perhaps, rather than cooperation. Thanks.
And I think just one more point on that before we move to Brad's question in the chat. What we're talking about these things doing is improving efficiency, because when we cooperate in accommodating others' needs, we're being more efficient. Somebody shares information with me when I'm trying to do something, I'm more efficient as a result of that information or those skills or the recommendation or advice that they've given me. So we have efficiency, we have productivity, we have resilience. There's all of these kinds of words we can use to describe what these outcomes of social capital mean within organizations and communities. And that then, like I always talk about how we're reconnecting with the importance of being social. We need to find ways to communicate this to people who are not used to thinking about this. And these are the kinds of ways I think you're talking about, that we're talking about now, that I think is really helpful in that. All right, let's go to Brad's question. And I think that's probably going to be about all we've got time for. So the question is, it seems when we think about social capital and X, it profoundly shapes how we understand and manifest social capital. For example, your example of social capital in AI brings its own dynamics. As an American, social capital authoritarianism sparks so many interpretations, uses, results, etc. An anthropological lens helps me, and I'm not sure I agree with your response about transcending culture. Social capital both shaped by and shapes the enabling conditions. Yeah, I agree with that last point. I mean, it does definitely is shaped by and shapes the enabling conditions. Like that is how social capital functions. If you think about social capital as an action, the outcome is an action. That action obviously is shaping the stock of social capital itself. I think the point really about different cultures is that humans fundamentally have similar kinds of social and emotional needs, just manifest in different kinds of ways. And I think that the overall framework for understanding how social capital is developed, the process would be the same. It's just significant differences in the way. But actually, as I talk about that, I'm thinking I'd really love to explore that and whether it does hold true and in what ways it holds true. So your first point, though, and I agree, we typically do talk about social capital and X, whatever that might be, public health, environmental management, organizational performance, the list goes on, disaster preparedness. And it does shape the way in which we think about and understand social capital. But you can see how within the logic schema, within the ontology, you can see how we're really interested in how it functions in different ways to produce different kinds of outcomes. And so we can understand then that kind of idea of working backwards is really useful rather than these kind of generic approaches to research where, hey, let's just measure the level of connectedness and then correlate that with organizational performance. It's like, yeah, but you're not understanding like the nature, like so organizational performance is the future benefit or return. What actions of individuals contributes to that? What nature of social capital contributes that? What nature of the enabling environment produces that? Like that is more specific, and that's what probably should be investigated. Otherwise, you just end up with this generic correlation between degree of connectedness and organizational performance, and it misses all of the mechanisms of how it actually functions. I often see research that is titled something like, is social capital important for X? And I think to myself, that's a truism, isn't it? Because we're defining social capital as something that has future benefits or returns, something that is productive and positive. And then you're asking the question, is it important for X? Well, of course it is. That's how we're defining it. But the reason why this research is done is because they don't mean social capital in this kind of coherent, comprehensive way. They mean social capital in terms of something narrow, in terms of homophily, or in terms of social connectedness, or something that's narrow. And then that is a relevant question. But I ask myself all the time, well, why don't you actually say what you mean then? And say, does ethnic diversity influence organizational performance? Rather than using the term social capital, which implies that it's something bigger than what you're actually looking at. Anyway, I think I've got a little bit off topic there. I'm not certain I've answered your question either, so feel free to follow up in the chat. There was one other comment you made there in relation to Zubair's comment about social capital shapes and is shaped by interaction and generative dynamics of individual and collective predispositions on the human identity and development. Yeah, exactly. I love it. This is the kind of understanding the mechanisms that I really encourage people to connect with, rather than what we often see in the literature, which is social capital is networks and no further description of the mechanisms that actually produce the outcomes. All right, any final questions or comments? We have 2 minutes left, so it'll have to be a quick one. I think we're done. Thanks everyone for taking part. Please follow along with the work that we're doing and the webinars that we have upcoming. We certainly have a lot of events over the next couple of months. And of course, we're all gearing up for our international conference in Dubai in March of 2026. Hopefully I can meet a lot of you there. Please keep us in mind and subscribe for our events.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.